Love it or hate it, I think there's a lot to discuss with this book.
I'm Foulmouth. F you, motherfucker. Quack.
Howdy there, Marty here, and we're back in this video with a review and discussion on N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which is part of a trilogy called The Broken Earth. Yes, there is a lot to discuss here, so let's get right into it. At this point, I don't suspect there are going to be too many people that are going to watch this video that haven't already read this book, as a lot of the times, reviews sort of just exist to validate people's already pre-existing feelings. And like a lot of my videos, first we'll talk about some of the kind of basics of the book, my general feelings, whether or not I like the book or not. Spoiler alert, I did like the book. And then we'll get a little bit deeper into some of my more specific feelings and criticisms or what have you. Speaking very generally, I did really enjoy this book. It was probably the most fun I'd had reading a new fantasy book, new to me fantasy book, since I first read Wheel of Time, probably back in 2003, thereabouts. Now, not to mislead, there are books that I've read since that I probably liked better, but when it comes to like pure enjoyment of the read, besides Eye of the World, this is probably the most fun that I've had reading a fantasy book overall. And I will say, I probably liked this better than all the Wheel of Time books, at least all the ones that I finished. I think I read like the first 9. I probably liked this better than all but maybe Eye of the World, and then the Shadow Rising, whatever the 4th book I want to say was. But honestly, I probably like this better than the 4th book. Maybe Eye of the World would just edge this out slightly for me, just to give a little bit of perspective on what I enjoy. This book is a lot of fun, and worth reading just based on the fun factor. I will say it might be worth looking up trigger warnings depending on certain sensitivities. There are a lot of traumas that get touched upon within this book. It's also very violent. There's a fair amount of sexual content, and overall, it's a very emotional tale, so depending on kind of what you're after, what your levels of sensitivities are on certain topics, it might not be the book for you, but nothing in this book took away from my personal enjoyment. Do with that what you will. And before we get too deep into it, I want to just come out the gate and give you my star rating now on this book, just to really firmly establish how much I did enjoy this book, as what it does well, it does incredibly well. So it deserves a little bit more of a tip of the cap. So I'm going to come in a little bit hot here with a 4.25 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book, but I'm saying that now because when we do get to some of my criticisms of it, I fear that it might sound like I'm being overly critical or kind of just piling up on it. So I'm saying now, I really like this book. So just to touch upon the story a little bit, and it's a little bit hard to do that without actually spoiling the book. It is worth noting that, of course, this is set in a fantasy world of sorts. It's not entirely clear if it's a version of Earth or not. Once again, I'm just reading this from the first book. I don't know if there's more to it. But it does take place in a fantasy setting where the Earth itself is essentially viewed as a hostile entity. And what I mean by that is that the Earth essentially is in a constant state of seemingly intentionally trying to destroy the humanity on its surface. This is typically represented in what they call seasons, which are basically these earth-shattering cataclysmic events like massive earthquakes or volcanoes that either wipe out big pockets of humanity or set humanity back hundreds or even thousands of years. In this book, there are people that are born that are known as origins or origines. Not exactly sure on the pronunciation of that. I probably should have looked that up. Oh well, too late now. And they're born or even sometimes bred into this world, and they have the ability, amongst other things, to basically control or manipulate or sense seismic activity or geological activity, things like that. Not only can they sense it, they can also control or mitigate or completely eliminate seismic activity, essentially protecting humanity. I would kind of view them in this story sort of like the X-Men in Marvel Comics, the mutants, where they're essentially entirely viewed with a certain level of fear and distrust or hate. They're often hunted down or killed just for being what they are, which does sometimes feel weird when they exist also in this world to save the world, and people more or less kind of know that, but it is sort of your basic fear of the unknown, that sort of deal, kind of like the X-Men in Marvel Comics. Also, similarly to like Xavier's School for Gifted Mutants in Marvel Comics, or even like Hogwarts in Harry Potter, there's an institute called the Fulcrum in which these people are essentially raised and trained to use their abilities to then serve, and honestly, they're actually essentially enslaved to serve society. The story picks up with 3 point of view characters, and it's really about their various journeys within this world. And I don't really want to go into it too much more than that because we're going to start to drift into spoiler territory really quick. But hopefully that is enough to pique your interest on if this is something you wanted to read if you haven't already read it. Okay, talking about some of the things I liked. The first thing I've got to mention is this is an incredibly well-paced book. It flies by. It's probably the best paced book since I got back into reading in late August. So we're now talking, I don't know, in the neighborhood of, we'll say 50 books. This is probably the best paced book I've read in that period. I think I blew through it in about 6 or 7 days, maybe, with some kind of casual spurts and a few sessions of like 2 or 3 hour chunks or whatever, where I just couldn't put the book down. I would literally put the book down and then like moments later I would just pick it back up and keep reading it. So it just was constantly exciting and enthralling. I always wanted to see what happened next, and I wanted to see how the story unfolded. That said, and even though I don't really equate length to pacing, this book could have easily been 1, maybe even 200 pages longer, and I think it would have really helped the overall story, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I'm just kind of mentioning that now because people often conflate length and pacing. I don't think they're directly related necessarily. But this book, with the style of writing, it could have easily been 100 to 200 pages longer, and I think I would have gotten significantly more out of it. That said, the nice thing about the book is, you know, the pages themselves aren't like super crammed. And yeah, you just fly through because it's not very dense. The chapters are not overly long or anything like that, so you get that constant, very pleasurable sensation of just turning pages and getting through it. So the book honestly flies by, and it's exciting the whole time. And as I often like to do, I like to talk about the book physically, because I actually think that's a deceptively important component to one's enjoyment of a book. It matters how a book feels and looks when you read it. Maybe it's not the most important thing, of course, right? I really like this copy of the book in terms of the way it felt physically to read. It's got this really nice matte finish. The pages are essentially the perfect weight or thickness. The font is the perfect size, and it's super readable. Complete pleasure to read physically. You know, the margins are, you know, perfectly sized, very reasonably sized. It's not overly dense. Once again, kind of getting into the idea that the book just sort of flies by as you turn the pages. So the physical experience of reading this book was an absolute pleasure. I really, really enjoyed the size and the matte finish of the cover in particular. Great weight. It's got a decent, appropriate flop to it. Anyhow, moving on. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the characters. Just generally speaking, once again, the characters in this book are all incredible. They're very well imagined and characterized. They all have their own voices, motivations, desires. At no point you're in a room with these characters and you feel like you're losing track of who's talking or getting confused. That happens at no point. They all have their own distinct voices. So she handles that masterfully in this book. Next thing I want to comment on is the magic system. The magic system in this book is super awesome. The concept of being able to control seismic activity, amongst other things, but the ability to control seismic or geological activity is really cool. And outside of, like, say, like the superhero genre, I think it's pretty unique as well. For the most part, you don't have like wizards in stories like creating, controlling, manipulating things like earthquakes and fault lines and things like that. So that's really cool. The thing that makes this work really well, in my opinion, is that there's a very clear limitation to their powers, and there's a very clear cost or danger to their powers. Like, even the well-trained people within this world with their abilities, using their abilities still has a certain amount of danger. There's sort of a conservation of energy within the way their powers operate. And there's sort of a finite amount that you can kind of use it, generally speaking. I just think it's really cool. It's really thoughtful. And I think in a fantasy setting, it's actually pretty unique the way she handles it. So yeah, kudos for sure. Okay, I want to get a little bit deeper now about the things that I liked or even didn't like. So from here on out, it's probably worth considering it spoiler territory. So if you have genuine interest in reading this book, you could pretty much skip to the end of the video, or skip away from the video is probably the more appropriate action. Just make sure that you like and subscribe before you head out. So here on out, spoilers are going to happen, and this book is a really fun read, and I would hate for you to spoil this for yourself if you have a genuine interest in reading it. So I'll see you next time. Thank you. So talking about the story a little bit deeper, I really enjoyed how the three main storylines are essentially across time, right? All being the same character at different points in her life. That's super awesome. I will say, of course, the drawback to that, to a certain degree, is pretty much once you identify that's happening in the story, you do lose some of the tension, and it kind of becomes an exercise in how does she get to that final spot. Overall, didn't really take away from the fun of it, for sure, but once you figure out that it's all the same character, you do lose a little bit of the tension. And as we continue on here, forgive me in advance for potentially mispronouncing some of the character names, as some of them are a little bit on the tricky side. With that, I will say the Cyanite chapters are probably my favorite overall. She is sort of the midpoint for our lead character, but the Demaya and the Essen chapters aren't really too far behind, but the Cyanite chapters are probably my favorite overall. The Essen chapters are very interesting because they're largely written, or maybe entirely written, but largely written in the second person, which I think for some readers is probably a bit of a distraction. For me, it worked pretty well. I thought it was cool, if nothing else, just to see someone attempt to write in the second person, as virtually nobody writes in the second person for the most part, at least not for regular novels, right? And I will say, as a seasoned D&D player, I actually thought it worked pretty well, and if nothing else, it was an interesting attempt, and for me, it doesn't distract or didn't take away from the story at all, but I've heard a little bit of a buzz of general criticism on that fact, but I thought it was a really cool attempt, so I actually enjoyed the Essen chapters largely because of the attempt, on top of the fact that her journey is, of course, interesting and tragic at the same time. But yeah, I thought that was a really cool attempt. It is also interesting that it's only in the Essen stories, or chapters rather, and not so much in the Demaya or the Cyanite chapters. Maybe not at all. Now I'm kind of maybe misremembering, but yeah, it's sort of an interesting attempt. So I'll give some credit there for sure. The Demaya chapters end up being slightly disappointing for me, as I do really enjoy her journey. I just found it a bit disappointing that you don't get more of her, like, at the fulcrum, just actually training and living her life, and just sort of what her existence looks like there. There is enough, but I do think this is a good example of how, if the book were just a little bit longer, maybe even just 2 or 3 extra chapters of her at the fulcrum, that would have been really enjoyable, just to see how life really looks there, as I don't feel like we get enough to get a super great sense of what it actually looks like her training. For the most part, it's kind of told like in hindsight. You don't really get to see her, for the most part, in sessions actually learning or accomplishing tasks. There's reference to those things happening, but you don't really get very much of it. It's not like Harry Potter, where you get a lot of them actually in the classroom and training and learning and all that kind of stuff. I just wanted more of it personally, so ultimately that's slightly disappointing. And that's sort of going to be the overall narrative of my feelings on this, is the book just needed to be more of it, I think, for me to get maximum enjoyment out of it. Furthermore, or I should say similarly, the Cyanide storyline, in particular, kind of where she ends up on the island, where she has the kid, she's with Alabaster and everybody, you really don't get very much time there, all things considered. I think, once again, 2 or 3 more chapters, just her on the island, with those, exploring those relationships and those people. I think it would have overall made the conclusion of everything that much more powerful as you became more attached to that world and that sense of life. You have her there for a lot of time, but once again, that's sort of addressed in time skips. And then when things start to fall apart, it all happens really quickly. It's not much of a process. It's just life is basically great there for this, outside of the fact that she's basically a little bored. But more or less, life is great there. And then she basically goes off on the one pirate voyage, and then everything basically falls apart right after that. There's not really a series of events to happen or to build to that. There's not a lot of building that takes place in this story. It's basically a massive series of vignettes where things just happen really fast and then conclude. At least that's sort of how it feels to me as the time jumps around. Because each storyline, of course, is set in its own time, but then in between the chapters, there's often time skips that don't really allow the story to breathe entirely. You're basically getting what feels like notable event after notable event after notable event, with not a lot of time to breathe and explore in between each of those events. So I think the book overall, especially in the Maya and the Cyanide storylines, really could have benefited from just more time to breathe and explore the world and the characters that you don't really get much of. And with that lack of time within the world, aka the lack of pages in this book, you really don't get a whole lot of time to explore. The book certainly gives you enough on the way the world looks and operates, but it's sort of surface level to me. Yes, you know that communities kind of exist or exist largely in these communities known as comms. People themselves are kind of born into caste systems. You also discover that the communities, or at least some of the communities, operate with some form of democracy. But then that's pretty much it. There's not really a greater understanding of the politics of this world. Really how maybe even these comms coexist. There's not really a sense of maybe the existence of a military or the way territory works or anything along those lines. There's not really a great sense of how the economy functions. I guess there's a lot of meat left on the bone in terms of what you could have explored. A lot of things are just touched upon, but it really doesn't go any deeper than that. And I think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity. I don't really need everything explained. I really honestly don't. I don't want a bunch of obnoxious info dumps. And that said, there's actually very little exposition in this book, if that's a thing for you. It actually makes the book kind of feel like a first-person read, which I actually think is more interesting. But once again, there's really not a whole lot of details given. I think you could have given more, and it would have kind of helped the overall appreciation of the world if you had a bit bigger understanding of some of those things that just lightly, or maybe not even, get touched upon. For example, even the level of technology in this world. It's really unclear overall where they're at. You have things in this world, you have literal electricity, you have things like asphalt, cookie sheets. So it's really hard to get a sense of the level of technology. I like the potential idea, and maybe this is just the way I'm interpreting it, is that when the seasons basically destroy humanity to some degree, it sets back technology or allows technology to not progress beyond a certain point. I think that idea is cool, but once again, you don't really have a good sense of technology's place in their world or even how it exists. But it's very hard to place, which on one hand does lend to the curiosity of the whole thing and the sense of discovery. I just think we could have been given a little bit more to greater appreciate this world rather than just being kind of left in the dark. I do think that covers most of the things I want to talk about with this book. Overall, yes, I really enjoyed it. I would recommend this probably to readers that are character first readers rather than the types of readers that hyperfixate on details, because as I think I've established, the book does kind of want for more detail. I really think it could have used more to make it overall a better experience, but the characters are super awesome and the book moves incredibly well. So if you're a reader who is a character first reader, I definitely recommend this book. I would also say I recommend this book for either new readers to fantasy or for readers who are just looking to get out of a slump, because it does move super well. It's very well told. It's super exciting and emotional. It's one of those books that I really have a hard time picturing anyone being bored whilst reading it. Now, you might not like the book. You might not like the content. Okay, fine. But I don't see how you could be bored reading it. This book is certainly not boring, so I would be very confused by anyone bored reading this book, so I think it's a really great slump buster, as it were, or if you're once again new to the fantasy genre. Like I said, and I really mean it, it's the most fun I've had reading a fantasy book since I first read Eye of the World way back in like 2003 or whenever it was. I have a suspicion it's not necessarily going to be a favorite of super old school fantasy fans, like older fantasy fans in particular. This certainly isn't your typical Tolkien-esque or medieval sword and sorcery style fantasy book. This book, though, is a book that moves incredibly well, has great characters, is super exciting, and if you're looking for a new flavor in the fantasy genre, like a setting beyond like your typical European-esque medieval whatever, this is a great option. It certainly doesn't feel that way. Now, if you don't like that and you really, really just like your Song of Ice and Fire, like European analog kind of story, this might not be for you. But if you're open-minded, if you're an open-minded person, I think most readers will enjoy this book. Welp, that's pretty much going to do it for this one. I sure hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please hit that like button. If you'd like to see more videos from me, please hit that subscribe button. As I always say, it makes me feel like I accomplished something. But otherwise, I will see you in the next one. Bye.